Thanks everybody for coming. My name's Conor Carville. I'm co-director with Stephen Matthews, who's over here, of the Beckett Centre at Reading. We're here tonight to listen to two of our creative fellows. We appoint creative fellows every year. Sometimes they're writers, sometimes they're artists, sometimes they're musicians. They happen to be two writers this year, so we thought it would be a nice opportunity to get off campus really and come down to London to a place that's associated with Beckett and have a little get together in the back room, and here we are. So Simon is going to read first, followed by Claire-Louise. After that there'll be the Q&A, so I'll just briefly introduce the two writers. Simon is a writer and an essayist, author of the Absalom trilogy, published by Salt. He's currently completing a short novel coming out of the fellowship, as well as a critical book about the future of the novel. Claire-Louise Bennett has written two acclaimed works of fiction: a collection of short stories, Pond, from Fitzcarraldo in 2015, which was shortlisted for the Dylan Thomas Prize. And in 2022, Check Out 19, which was shortlisted for the Goldsmiths Prize. And she's recently been awarded the European Literature Prize 2023. Simon will go first and then Claire-Louise. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much, Conor. So I'm going to read a work in progress really in response to the fellowship. Basically what I've been interested in particular is Beckett's so-called closed space stories from the mid-60s through to the late 60s and early 70s. The number of seats in each row would, of course, reduce as, increasing his pace, he continued moving forwards down the steps of the aisle towards the stage. Which is to say, as he continued on a diagonally downward trajectory towards the longitudinal centre line of that cylindrical auditorium. Although, rather than reducing to a single unit, the limiting case, the point at which each seating section, as it were, pointed towards the stage, must, he thought, given the social nature of theatre going as it's known, be a pair. Meaning, in short, that rather than consisting of a triangle or a sector, using the latter in the formal sense of the shape enclosed between an arc and two radii at either end of that arc, each section would consist, in fact, of an isosceles or symmetrical trapezoid, pointing towards the stage, with my first thought being that we were entirely unsuited, which is to say of a trapezoid or trapezium formed effectively by removing a smaller equilateral triangle from one of the vertices of a larger such triangle, or by removing this smaller equilateral triangle from a sector formally defined, while also removing a segment from this sector. With six such isosceles trapezoids fitted together around that central stage, although slightly separated from each other to form 6 aisles, such as the one he continued moving down. Within each of the auditorium's 3 levels, hence the equilateral nature of the triangles from which they were or could be formed. With the removal of the aforementioned segments in the situation where one took the trapezoid to be formed in the manner described from a sector formally defined, being such that they afforded additional space within the central portion of the rear or base of each trapezoid, adjacent, that is, to the internal facade of the cylinder. A space in which any latecomers might conveniently congregate, he thought, as, despite having increased his pace in the aforementioned manner, he found the right hand of his pursuer grasping now his shoulder, at least momentarily, with the result that he could no longer very easily continue upon his trajectory, at least not with the portion of his body that had been clamped momentarily in this way. And you thought I was unfazed when the split eventually came, meaning, that is, that, given the speed differential that had now been set off within the upper half of his body, he started turning ever so slightly clockwise when viewed from above. Or, more specifically, that his torso commenced a slight clockwise turn as he continued proceeding in the manner described, having instantaneously decided that he would also start to revolve what was traditionally taken to be the seat of knowledge, the head, more or less horizontally. That is, that he would turn to face them as it's known, thereby exposing his facial features to multiple pairs of eyes. behind and to one side of him within the dimness of that auditorium, with the more or less being a reflection of the steepness of the steps, in that, in attempting to keep himself intact in descending in the manner described towards what he took to be the spare or unbooked seat, he had tilted his head slightly forwards so as to survey what it was he was progressively stepping into, particularly in terms of judging the depth of those steps, while maintaining sufficient horizontality in the position, that is, of his head, to enable himself to survey the area, or more specifically row of or containing the spare seat, to monitor in particular that it remained unoccupied. Although note that in both modes of clockwise revolution, which is to say the motion when viewed from his right of tilting the head forwards to judge in particular the depth of each step, whilst continuing to monitor the visual field beyond, particularly in the aforementioned area of interest, and the motion when viewed from above of turning finally to his right to face his interlocutor, that the final part of the revolution in each case would involve only the eyeballs in their sockets, with the head then by that stage fixed in position, with another complicating factor being that once he had in fact turned to face his interlocutor, their face would be at a higher, or perhaps even a much higher, level than his, something that he would only be able to fully factor in once he, in the form specifically of his eyes, was or were in a position literally to take the measure of them, such that, in short, he could adjust the angular trajectory of those eyes, as well as the head housing them, to account specifically for his interlocutor's height, and the fact that this was likely to be further accentuated compared to his own position by at least one or possibly two steps, meaning that their face would be equivalently relatively elevated in relation to his, something that, as before, he would not be able to fully account for in his swivelling round to his right in the manner described, until, that is, he was able to take them in as it's known.
Okay, hi, I'm not going to introduce it because we're going to have a Q&A, and you'll kind of find out a bit more about it then, so I'll just get into it, I suppose. I don't sit down to write a story or a book. I don't sit down to make a plan, map things out, sketch an arc. I write whatever is in my head, whatever comes, whatever is of interest to me, whatever is troubling me, whatever I'm hiding, whatever persists. I can't control it, I don't try. It builds up, the pages, the notebooks build up. I have an extensive sprawling backlog and it's all muddled up and I'm trying to straighten it out. I'm reading each page and deciding there and then what to ditch and what to hang on to. The pages I elect to keep, I'm attempting to categorise. Several piles are there to my right, covering the spare bed. They cover it completely. I can't lie down on it. Sometimes I would like to. It would be nice to lie down in this room, but I can't. It's not obvious to me right away, glancing over at the piles there to my right, what the particular category of each one is. I have to think a bit before it comes back to me. Though a few of them do have distinct enough designations: childhood, place, dream, XN, desire, and personal, many more have not acquired a label identifying a theme. They do not have a thing, they have a vibe, I suppose, a certain sort of energy, a mood perhaps. Personal is what will be burnt when I get ill. If I get ill, I could of course die suddenly. With that in mind, it's clear that a note will need to be affixed to the top of this particular pile, instructing whoever finds it that it must be burnt in its entirety right away, and it's a sizable pile. It's personal, and I'm entitled to that, just as anyone is. Would it be better to insert these various piles into folders? I bought 13 bottle green manila folders at 50 cents each for this very purpose a few weeks ago, and they are also on the bed, in a pile. In front of me, here on the table, is a small box containing a roll of white labels. The idea was I would put each pile into an individual folder, and then I would write on a label very neatly: childhood, place, dream, X, N, and so on. And I would stick that label onto its corresponding folder. Once all the papers were filed in this way, I would lay all 13 folders out across the bed, more or less back in the same place as the pile had occupied when they were in their natural state, and that would be very tidy and organised. That would be progress, wouldn't it? And it would mean, if I wanted to, I could scoop up the folders very easily. I could scoop them up off the bed and put them down on the chair, the one I am currently sitting on, and there would be nothing upon the bed then, which means I could lay on it at last. I could lay on the bed, stretch right out. We could change places for a while. That would be nice. I haven't done it. Perhaps all those folders, 13 of them side by side, would look unnervingly expectant all across the eiderdown, bottle green, one after the other, like placeholders for incongruous bedfellows. And, as I've said, a number of the piles are in any case unnameable, though perhaps one could be given the sobriquet graves. The personal pile won't fit inside a manila folder. It will need to go into a box, its very own box, and that is as it should be, really. It ought to have its very own box, and there ought to be a lock on it, and a note, of course, about burning it immediately. Perhaps that could be engraved on the box, in fact. Wouldn't that be very dapper? Who could flout my request then? I should have it engraved. In the event of my death, burn immediately. That's not right at all. In the event. As if it might not happen. It will happen. The very moment I perish, burn immediately. Ridiculous. Do not enter. Burn right away. No, no, no. If I am dead and you have found this, do not enter. Do not dislodge contents either. Burn immediately. Perfect. I can't imagine anyone not following through on my entreaty if it's presented as elegantly as that. This won't go in that box. I don't know where it will go. I know very well that it is adding to the problem being volume of words impossible to classify, to even justify, building up and getting on top of me. What is any of it about, really? I need to date my notebooks. I haven't got to those yet, haven't even lifted the lid. I've so far been tackling the loose sheets and they're all jumbled up. The earliest ones in the maelstrom are from as far back as 30 years ago. Some of this stuff that has neither distinct theme nor singular vibe I have already transcribed by hand into a brand new notebook, another notebook. Undoubtedly, it would have been much more efficacious to type the pages up directly. And to begin with, that's what I had in mind. That's exactly what I pictured myself doing whenever I contemplated how on earth to get started on such a colossal undertaking. Undertaking, yes. Typing. That's what I saw myself doing, typing industriously, typing assiduously, typing ardently. But actually, I can't stand typing. That's what I realised. Oh, once there's a good bit up there, I don't mind it so much. I don't mind it when I can scroll up and down and there's a good bit up there, up and down. But at the beginning, when there is nothing at all and then very little, I can't stand that. The feeling of emptiness that induces, of being cut off from everything, is ossifying. As long as I am writing by hand, it all feels connected. It's simply a continuation. I don't have to think about where to start. I don't have to start, because really it is a place, and I am already there. That's right, it's a place, and I live there and always have, and I don't want to leave. I don't want to let go of the pen and leave and go downstairs to nothing, to emptiness, to the calcifying coldness of that. Excavating and transcribing go on in a room upstairs, and typing is allocated to a room downstairs where I have absolutely no words to hand. Just one notebook, perhaps. One or two. Sitting there then, more or less, entirely divested and put on the spot, and knowing very well there are pages upstairs that I haven't yet got to, containing God knows what. Hundreds of them. Hundreds upon hundreds containing God knows what. How can I go on without them? Everything is entangled. It's impossible to keep what seems to be an isolated episode contained. It's not isolated at all. I can trace it back. Of course I can. I can see how something from before presaged it and how something before that presaged that occurrence, and on. Inescapable sequence. I can go back and all the way back to the bungled root of it, all the way back to when I was born. Feet first in the bonny month of May with a pulsing umbilical cord wrapped about my neck. Being born practically killed me. So naturally, since on my arrival into the world, I was immediately strung up. It has been a little challenging for me to believe I've ever been innocent. Coming into the world like that, neck in a noose, my God. There is still so much to straighten out, to read through and date and categorise. But I can't wait until that's all done before I get going on something. I realise that now. I realise I can't stay upstairs forevermore. I have to come downstairs. I'll have to go up and down, in fact. Up and down. When you're in one room, you become afraid of the other. So even though I'll probably be downstairs for a while, I should also, from time to time, pop into the room upstairs and sit there for a while. Sit there, even if it's only to look out the window, to prevent it from becoming utterly impossible for me to ever set foot in there again. But I can no longer sit there describing day in, day out, with all those piles across the bed to my right. And it seems to me that if I got started on a recent occurrence, that would surely limit my sense of being divested and cut off and so on, because the material pertaining to a recent occurrence is surely easy enough to locate, residing as it does surely in my most recent notebooks, and not strewn here and there and God knows where in the depths of that immense jumble of muddled up pages upstairs. A recent occurrence such as Terence Stone, that's what I've been thinking, that's recent. That business began the year before last, I believe, which means anything I've had to say in relation to Terence Stone will have been written in the last 3 years, which is very manageable. Getting going on something concerning X, for example, is less manageable because that's 12 years, and X said he loved me and I said I loved him, and as such things were a big mess. All over the place, stopping and starting over and over again. X is a pile on the bed, fairly sizable, a drop in the ocean. I know full well there is much more still to come. He frequently pops up in a notebook that on first glance appears to be dedicated to an entirely separate and unrelated aspect and time of my life. It was impossible to keep him out. He could be anywhere. He could be anywhere. So I have to look everywhere, so that's a difficulty. So Terence Stone then. How to outline that? Terence Stone is a pseudonym and not a pleasing one. It's too dynamic to my ears. Alan Wilkes is probably better. Or Paul Ferris. Names clearly are not my thing, but he has to have one because for one thing, he was a teacher, and furthermore, he wrote me a letter. Teachers are their names, and not much else. Their names, in fact, are often a source of incessant amusement. That's how it is at the time, and for that reason, their names persist in the memory, on and on, long past that time. So they have the last laugh, really. And you can't talk about a letter and who wrote it without giving a name. Any name would do. It doesn't have to be his own name. The point is, he can't be without one. Bowles is a thoroughly good surname. Radcliffe, Simmons, Clark, Jones, Peterson. I can't think of many. I have to really scratch my brain to come up with anything because the surnames here where I live now aren't like the surnames where I lived then. Very different altogether. And it has to be right because his name, his full name, comes up again and again. The point is, Paul Ferris, let's say, was my A-level English teacher, and the year before last, I think it was, I received an email from my first publisher forwarding on an email he had sent them addressed to me. And I'll leave it there.
The first thing I'd like to ask you, as creative fellows who've been working on Beckett across the last year before I throw it open to the audience, is how's your view of Beckett changed? Has it changed by working so intensively on his work, coming over to Reading, looking at some of the archival material, talking to folks such as Connor and myself about Beckett, who've read and taught Beckett across our lives in very different kind of mode, of course, to your engagement with him. But a few words about what Beckett meant to you then and what Beckett means to you now.
Yeah, I mean, firstly, I feel very grateful to have been invited to the fellowship. What the main thing it did for me was it gave me permission to immerse myself in Beckett again. I mean, why I needed permission to do that, I don't know. I could have done that anyway. But yeah, because my sort of engagement with Beckett sort of came in the late 90s. I've sort of written a bit about this. For example, I remember very clearly, partly in my journals, the first time I read The Lost Ones, I was sort of in Mexico just trying to finish a novel and went into the English language sort of lending library there. And so and it was a very strong experience and just deepened my sort of sense of that period within Beckett, basically.
I suppose what I enjoyed really was discovering the more kind of, I suppose, human side of him, finding out about his love affairs and stuff. I'm a terrible gossip anyway, so kind of it's fun. but it was interesting to discover that. And what I hadn't realised really is that how autobiographical a lot of his work is actually, and I didn't really, or it wasn't particularly relevant then in my way of thinking about his work, but it became so when I started to think about the German diaries and what role they had. I'm very interested in diaries generally, and the function they have in a writer's life and in a writer's development as a writer. And he wrote the German diaries, I think from, was it 36 to 37? He was there for about 6 months or so, and he was in a bit of a funk because he'd finished a Murphy. It was out on submission and it wasn't doing terribly well. It was getting a lot of rejections, and that's not a great place to be in. And he was just keeping a diary, and he was looking at a lot of art and different things while he was in Germany. He was going to lots of museums and before they got confiscated by the Nazis, which was sort of going on. So it's a bit of an alarming time to be there. And I thought initially that that's what I would get into, looking at the sort of visual aspect, I suppose, because I've written bits and bobs about still life painting and so on. But then I just became more interested in this role of the journal, really, and what that allowed him to do. And they were kind of, he was, I suppose, faced with certain challenges that I identified with, such as, how do you work with personal material without really revealing yourself? And I think for a while, to begin with, a work like Dream of Fair to Middling Women, there's a lot piled on to that in terms of references, and it's very sort of erudite, and he really did actually want to just move away from that. And he did say in an interview, I think in something like 46, that he wanted to write how he felt, and for me to actually read that was just kind of amazing, because you don't necessarily always associate Beckett with feeling, but then of course there's so much feeling in the work. And so it was, and also discovering that aspect, I suppose, the more emotional dimension to it, that I really, really, really was struck by very much, and got a very different sense of him from that.
Yes.
Yeah.
And seeing the progress of the manuscript through that, which often sort of navigates through that kind of personal side of things and becomes something very different, doesn't it? Simon, you introduced your piece, didn't you, talking about its origins with the set of The Lost Ones and how that fascinated you, and what was it, that kind of realisation of, as it were, the visualisation, to use Claire-Louise's word, of The Lost Ones did, do you think, in terms of creating the piece that you read to us earlier?
Well, firstly, it sounded, when I introduced it, like a very straightforward matter, didn't it? Of changing seats. I read about as much as I could bear, well, I don't really know actually what interested me. I mean, one of the things I've been doing today, I'm trying to write a piece for Tolka Journal in Ireland, which I'm very pleased to be doing that. And one of the things I've been amazed by recently with my writing is feedback from editors. There's sort of 3 or 4 editors commenting, and basically it's sort of prodding me in the direction of why am I interested in this? And as I say, I'm interested in that particular period of claustrophobia, closed space. Often there's just one figure in this, say a cube or some sort of rotunda, and they're having to be they're bent so that they can actually fit in that space. There's a piece where the only thing that moves is the left eye of these 2 figures, and one of the things I've been looking at today is, so I come from a sort of engineering background, so I studied acoustics I studied vibration. And my dissertation title was to do with closed spaces and the effect of putting certain things in closed spaces for loudspeakers. So I still haven't answered the question, but I just sort of think I've been interested in something here for a long time. That's what I sort of discovered today.
Yeah. What led you to write the piece that you've written, Claire-Louise?
Well, at the time, so I live in Ireland. I've lived in Ireland for the last 25 years or so. So I was coming over. I think I came over maybe 3 or 4 times to the archive, and it was all kinds of different things were sort of interesting to me. But at the same time, actually, that I was making the trips over, I had another kind of project going on at home. I did have a really nice photograph of my home, but anyway. So it's in County Galway. It's an old kind of 1950s style house. And I moved into it about 18 months ago, I suppose. And it's a nice bit of space there, actually. And one of the things I had with me was a very big trunk, which is full of loose sheets of writing that go back about 30 years or so. And then in addition to that, there's quite a big kind of chest box full of notebooks and journals that go back a long time too. And I was sort of referring to these objects as, my stuff or my crap or whatever. And I mentioned it to Major one day and he went, "That's your archive." Oh dear God. Oh dear God. So it was kind of funny then, because I was looking at the Beckett archive and I was thinking, really? Okay. And maybe I need to get into this trunk and into this box and see what I've got in here before anybody else does, kind of thing. So it was kind of strange because for quite a long time I was thinking about the two things as quite separate things, and then I sort of saw that they kind of overlapped, and in a strange way it was sort of quite difficult for me to get into the boxes, and because I wasn't sure how to think about what was in there. What was I looking at? Was I trying to look at it as writing in a sort of a literary way, or was it personal writing, or what was it kind of thing? And it was sort of difficult to know what was really the most, I suppose, useful and compassionate way of thinking about it. And so in a bizarre sense, going to the Beckett archive and thinking about his own work and his use of, I guess, personal experience provided me with a kind of a methodology, really. And following on from that, I read the trilogy because really most of the time I'd sort of focus more on his plays and so on. So I hadn't read the trilogy before, and of course the three of them, the narrators in the trilogy, they're self-inscribers, and you have a real sense of that happening. At one point, Malone kind of loses his pencil for a bit, and it's quite alarming when that happens. You're like, oh, you're almost looking for it yourself, kind of thing. So there's a real sense of this thing happening as you're reading it. And so Beckett was obviously very interested in the relationship between sort of being and writing. And there's never any subject, particularly. There's never anywhere else, which I always really, really like. Because one of the things, I suppose, that really irritated me looking back over my own journals and my own loose sheets was like, I don't write about anything. I write about how fed up I am and how boring this is, and I don't understand why I'm writing it. And I don't know what's compelled me to do it. And I do it again and again, like, oh my God. It's not like I'm writing anything very exciting. So in a way it was very reassuring then to, discover someone like Malone and Loiney and think, well, they're doing it as well, so it's fine. You can kind of understand that actually what it is about, it's just about being here. That's all it is. You're just making a mark on a page, and that's sort of like, I was here in a way, kind of. It's pretty much an elaborate form of that to a degree. And so I just became interested in that, and then of course you've got Crap and Crap's last tape, chronicling his own experience in life with the tapes, and there's something about that too. There's a really moving part where he's playing a tape. I think was he maybe 39 or something, and there's a word that his 39-year-old self says, which he doesn't remember the meaning of anymore, because obviously his 39-year-old self was much more erudite and had a wider vocabulary. And I'm like, oh yeah, I know that too. Looking back, and you do have moments when you because you're confronted with the mind that you had and the range of it, and in some ways it's sort of narrowed, and then in other areas there's a sense of having expanded. So all those layers are just very, very interesting to me. So that's ultimately those two things sort of really very interestingly converged, and it was strange. It was strange that Beckett was able to sort of be sort of quite helpful in that way, and the whole task really did. And it was a shame because some of the photographs, I did take a couple of other photographs, but I didn't send them to, because the whole thing looks kind of very Beckettian. Really, there's it's a 1950s house, and I'm upstairs doing the transcribing, and there are piles and piles and on the bed, and then there's lots of screwed up stuff on the floor. And you look out the window and there's fields, and it's the west of Ireland, and then I'm transcribing into a book, and I'm like, why are you doing in a book? Or why don't you just type it up onto a computer? But I just couldn't do it. So then I'm like, but you're just making more. And then not only was I writing that into a notebook, I was actually then keeping a note of the whole process itself. So that's in another notebook. And then in another notebook, I was writing about the dreams that was all throwing up. So there's more now. I've actually made more. Which is kind of
is the idea in some way to then, for both of you in a way, charting this kind of process to find a way to publish those different notebooks together, or to think about those different visualizations alongside what you're writing? Is it pushing towards, in other words, thinking about a new way of handling the text, or thinking about the text, or, I mean, in other words, when your piece gets published, would you like to see some kind of version of the stage set alongside it? Would you like to see a kind of 3-column kind of piece that has all of the different kind of reflections upon reflections upon reflections? Is that something that's, do you think, is emerging?
I mean, it's really interesting, that idea of reflections upon reflections. Partly I'm going back to your previous question, Stephen, as well. Because as I say, The Lost Ones is about these people, 200 bodies in a cylinder, and the New York production, they basically tried to recreate the cylinder. So as an audience, you went into this very claustrophobic space, and then you had David Warrilow, who's this celebrated Beckett actor, with this miniature cylinder with tiny bodies moving them around. So that reflection upon reflection, and then it's really interesting talking to the archivist, because for a long time I was trying to find that miniature. When I first spoke to Connor, I'd never been into an archive before, and I had a visualization that there's a box and a category on a shelf with this cylinder in. That's what I sort of visualized. And then I remember just sort of emailing the archivist and saying, can I come and see this? And it wasn't quite as simple as that. And what I found was that the cylinder was actually just on the floor in the reading room as you go in. It'd been there the whole time. But yeah,
I do tend to do that.
No, it's interesting. And it's very fragile sort of material. So it's a residue of a performance from the 70s of a text. So I find it very, very interesting. That whole sort of sequence.
Almost how the text has been used previously and how you're coming to it at a later point and seeing some of that. What about publishing different versions of the main text and the notebook text?
That's a good idea.
Why does it appeal? Does it appeal? I mean, why would it appeal?
It does. Because it's just interesting that you've raised it, I suppose, because I have been kind of thinking about form again as usual, and the idea of, you know, the novel being a certain sort of container, if you like, and can it contain that kind of variation or multiplicity or repetition. It's such a, you know, it's like, I suppose form has always sort of presented me with I suppose a kind of a challenge. I mean, Connor mentioned, yeah, for sure, right? Yeah, for sure. I mean, Connor mentioned Pond as a collection of short stories, and it's sometimes described as that, and sometimes it's described as a novel. I'm not sure where I stand with it, really. So yeah, again, I am kind of thinking about what is it that can. Well, it's not going to contain it, is it? I don't suppose that's the whole thing in a way. And that was interesting to. I mean, I think with one of the novels in the trilogy, I think once he'd got to the end of a notebook, physically, it was like, okay, well, that's the end then.
Yes.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's. I mean, that's kind of good.
Yeah.
That's the way. Yeah. There you go. I mean, that's. I mean,
that is
it's
fascinating.
Because it's. Yeah. I mean, because it is infinite, isn't it? And so, where do you create an endpoint within something that can just kind of, like you said, it's reflections on reflection, and you could just go on, couldn't you? You could just go on.
Well, he didn't go on though, did he? I mean, in that sense, he used the physical
right.
artifact of the notebook,
the limitation
and just that limited
that.
it, or he counted out 60 paragraphs for some of the later texts and just filled those. Are there any questions from the audience? Does anybody been prompted to ask anything? Yes?
I just wanted to ask Claire-Louise. First of all, I thought it was a really enchanting piece. I really enjoyed it. I just really wanted to ask about the idea of writing as creating a certain kind of space or territory. Like, I'm sure there's a line in Beckett somewhere, not a line, where Beckett talks about dropping down into the dark when he's writing. And it says the writing itself is about creating a little burrow or a den. And just with your piece, it was like you were creating these zones within the house. You know, there were piles of notebooks and piles of paper, and then in a different part of the house. And it seemed almost like it was kind of about that process, where writing is about creating a territory for yourself. I just wondered if you had any thoughts about that.
Yeah, I do. I mean, it feels very much like that, really. And yeah, it's sort of hard to. I'm glad you picked up on that in a way. And the going from one area to another, because actually for a while when I started trying to go through this my own archive, and I was doing it downstairs, I was getting ever so annoyed with it all. I had no patience really, and it seemed like my aim was just to kind of get rid of stuff, and I did get rid of some of it actually. And then I thought, maybe I'll just move it upstairs and I'll do it upstairs. And it changed the whole atmosphere and intention of it and everything. I just got it was much calmer upstairs, and I thought, well, it sort of makes sense really, because if you're downstairs you're kind of doing stuff, unless you're in the front room, I suppose. But I think it's always felt like that. And another thing I suppose I'm kind of conscious of is that I've always just moved around a lot. I'm still renting. And I've lived in, I don't know how many places in Ireland since I moved there. So there's always a sense of it being quite precarious and always kind of moving around. So maybe, in a way, there is a sense of what this is, the here-ness when I write, is something that is quite sort of stable and constant and ongoing, whereas everything else is sort of changing quite often, and I can't really control that. So it does feel very much like a kind of a returning to, and I think that's really why I do like the handwritten page, because it never feels like I'm starting from scratch, because it's a place I know.
Yeah, I mean, I was writing in a notebook rather than just because it's important to have like physical traces of what you've done somehow, and and then But yeah, I feel that when I'm writing, it is kind of like you're building a place that you can inhabit for a bit.
Yeah.
And it's quite a unique place, and you inhabit it.
But Beckett had a very specific way, didn't he, of using his notebooks. He tended to write on just right-hand side of the page, didn't they? Certainly in the earlier notebooks. I mean, there's inhabiting a notebook, and there are different ways of inhabiting a notebook and turning it over and going back the other way and things like that. Do you use linear progression, as it were, from start to finish, or do you actually see it as a bit of a kind of object that you can yourself play around with?
Yeah, I turn it upside down and start from the back.
Do you?
If it's a different, if it's a kind of a different sort of thing, or then I'll turn it around, and so I'll start again from the back.
Do you write longhand?
Just whatever the circumstances are. Sometimes I write longhand if I don't have a laptop. But I mean, in terms of space, I think maybe you can see why I'm interested in enclosed spaces. The intention I had was to write a short story about someone moving seats, but I sort of think somehow things, or what I'm interested in with Beckett's closed spaces is it's almost like things slow down, really sort of slow down. So I sort of think the enclosure is a way of trying to encompass something in its totality, to really sort of try to get to the bottom of something, So the worry for me is what I'm writing is becoming a novel, just to get the person from one seat to another. You can tell it's not going to be a short story, So one way to make it a short story is to make it very, very enclosed, and then maybe it's more straightforward.
Well, it's interesting. You're using geometry in a way to do that, to enable us to visualise the space itself. You were subdividing the space for us and you were drawing the lines, as it were, between the seats, between the characters.
Yeah, I mean, it might not seem like it, but the intention is to make it as clear and straightforward as possible. Just to really sort of be clear what's happening here, and to sort of tell the whole story of what's happening. And it's a failure, isn't it? Every time.
Yes. It's an isosceles triangle or whatever that you can't. Yes. Yes. Okay. Thank you. Any other questions that occurred to? Yes.
Could I ask both of you? The readings were marvellous. Thank you. Could I ask both of you about the methods you brought to the archive? Claire-Louise, you said you made 4 or 5 visits from Ireland. Simon, you were coming down from London, I guess. But how did you set about on a practical basis of exploiting the archive to your own ends?
I don't know whether I made the most of it in some ways. I just haven't been in that sort of environment for quite a long time, and I think I had a slightly antiquated idea about what an archive is and how it looks. Maybe partly based on Ghostbusters, actually. So it's not. I don't think it's like that. And you sort of have to know a little bit before what you're kind of looking for in a way. It's not something you can just kind of browse through and open boxes and that kind of thing, poke around. But that's interesting, because I did end up, and strangely you think you are being quite specific about what you request, but then what comes through is actually just very different from what you thought you asked for, which is quite funny. And I remember reading quite a good interview with Billy Whitelaw, and she'd, I think she was spending quite a lot of time in bed or something. She'd moved into a house, she got rid of the curtains, she said she'd given it to a pair of curtains to the builder, and she read a lot in bed, and so then I'm reading this, I'm like, I'm quite enjoying this, quite getting a nice sense of Billy Whitelaw, but so things were a bit random, to be quite honest. And then I guess there was just certain things in the reading room that I just got interested in, quite a bit of the philosophy stuff in a way, because that's really interesting, thinking about some of the underpinnings there. So I was reading a bit about, well, I suppose, because in a way, if you think about, I suppose, diary and life writing, and he was interested in himself in life writing. Like, he was interested in the work of St. Augustine, Rousseau, Proust, obviously. I suppose when you think about that form, well, even the name of it, life writing, it sounds like something quite sort of generative and quite sort of in itself maybe quite positive, like it's building towards meaning. But his sort of take on it, as we know, is sort of slightly degenerative, or dereliction profoundly felt, as I think he called it. So I became interested in how that shift kind of occurred, I suppose, because it was something I sort of identified with, and I sort of was thinking about the perversity of feeling that compulsion to write about self and direct experience when maybe your thoughts about what a self is, how does that kind of work then? So I got interested in those aspects, I suppose. And there was some very good material on that, and you've written some very interesting material on that, and so was Connor. So there was a wealth of information there, really, as well. Just talking to the guys there and so on about those thoughts and ideas. So yeah, just all a bit haphazard, really.
I guess my experience was sort of pulling on a thread. I think you set me off on the thread, Stephen, by introducing me to the archive and how it worked, and then I had these drafts of Imagination, Dead Imagine, I think, to start with, and then I just sort of systematically went through those stories, almost like year by year, but it wasn't systematic. I don't know what I was looking for either. It was. I feel like I got a reputation for coming into the archive, looking at something briefly and then leaving. I almost got embarrassed by sort of talking to the receptionist that she would sort of say, it's almost like, well, you're leaving already, and I sort of got a bit paranoid about that, So another way of talking about it is it's not academic. It's not an academic approach somehow. Don't quite know what I was looking for, but just sort of pulling on a thread. And for me, it's a pulling on a thread of depth. So talking to both of you, talking to others at the archive, just really helped. So a conversation about that production, the New York production. I really sort of got immersed in that theatre company. The sort of accounts of that, the sort of detail. So they were, going into this cylindrical space. They were asked to take off their shoes and take off their bulky sweaters. And they were given, these binoculars. Each audience member was given a pair of binoculars, presumably to look at this miniature set. So again, I just sort of got obsessed about those sort of details. But yeah, I'm not quite sure why, particularly. Yeah.
I don't think Connor or I are quite sure. I mean, I think that the whole idea of the fellowships, isn't it? It's very much kind of introducing you to the archive and then play, really. I mean, whatever direction you want to take it. And I think it's taken, with Hannah and Tim there, it's perhaps taken unexpected directions because, as you say, it's not academic, and we want to really just offer the opportunity and then, see what comes of that kind of luxury of material in a way. And I hope that that's been kind of exciting and rare experience in a way. That's what I think we're hoping would happen. Any other questions? Yes.
Thank you very much for the reading. So this is a question for Claire-Louise and Saima, but also perhaps for Stephen Connor as well. In that I was just wondering what this does to the archive, what the act of going on to the archive, responding to it, creating works out of it, actually does to the notion of the archive itself, whether you feel you're feeding back into it and changing it, or it's presumably a different thing once you've played in it. So I'd be interested to know if that's something worth pursuing.
What do you think about that?
I think my huge anxiety is that archives are dead things. A bit of what you were saying, that they too easily just become memorials in a way.
Yeah.
I mean, I know that Tim, you thought about the boxes and the archive and trying to think of ways of animating the archive or alternatively archiving something new that had happened. If you want to look on our Samuel Beckett Research Centre website, there's a film of the performance of Tim's string quartet, which has theatrical elements around bringing the archive around musicians. So I think when the initial idea around the fellowships and when Connor and I particularly started talking about them, is very much that sense of how do you make something that is otherwise inert into something that is full of new kind of voice and life and potential and music or visual art or whatever it might be. I think we're just really in this country in some senses sort of spoiled in terms of the materials that we have, but it's largely academic people who might vaguely occasionally be interested in opening those boxes. And what we hope to do is to think about Beckett's inheritance and the aftermaths of Beckett in a way by giving something from Beckett to new creations. I think new creations and creators that we felt, were really, potentially interested in what Beckett was, and forever will be. But I don't know. What do you think about it? I mean, Tim, chip in, Hannah, chip in if you want to, John. We've got several of our former fellows and current fellows in the room as well. But, I mean, what happened with the archive?
How did you both get on with Beckett's handwriting? Because that makes it quite inaccessible, doesn't it? Or
I think if you hold it slightly sideways, that's my kind of way of, yes, if you look at it aslant. But yeah, I mean, what happens to the actual artefacts in the archive? I mean, how does the archive change for you and change perhaps how, your own work, do you think?
I don't know. I find it difficult to answer because for me it's a new experience of working with an archive. So I can't particularly sort of comment on the archive itself. But apart from to say, it did feel something that's very alive to me. And so just in terms of the handwriting, I mean, Beckett's handwriting in French. I mean, there's one note which I was really pleased to be able to read, which is to do with a story called Ping, which basically it's a note that says this is a miniaturization of the story The Lost Ones, because The Lost Ones was just too difficult, intractable difficulties or whatever. I managed to read that short note apart from one word, which was indecipherable, so that was a great triumph.
A lot of it is typed up, though.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. But also, I mean, just you were chatting earlier about Beckett, writing on the right hand side, and then the left hand pages are fascinating as far as I'm concerned. They're doodles. They're sort of. I mean, particularly for me, I loved trying to work out the calculations he was making.
Yes.
Like what is this sum that he's doing? It's something to do with this space. But so I really got fascinated by those left-hand pages. Maybe I was mainly reading the left-hand pages, which is why I just left so quickly.
You realised you couldn't add up, and that was it.
Exactly. That's right. That's the lunch.
You mentioned earlier, Stephen, the idea of publication. The work that Simon and Claire-Louise produce, does the university publish it, does the research centre publish it, or do you work in association with the publisher?
We don't prescribe that. There is going to be an issue of Talker magazine, as Simon mentioned, that's going to have pieces by Claire-Louise and Simon, and we work in partnership now with Trinity College Dublin, and they have a creative fellowship programme around the substantial Beckett archives that are there at Trinity. So the idea is to bring the Trinity Creative Fellows and our current Creative Fellows together within covers. But no, previously it's been quite various. Emma McBride published her radio piece that she created with Faber, with her publisher. Tim has put a CD out of a version of his string quartet, so we don't.
Right.
Yes, I mean,
because in fact, as you said earlier, you don't always have writers
no.
as creative fellows. So why would you have a publishing program set up exactly? Sorry.
Yes, and in a way, I think, you know, the terms of the fellowship are very much about kind of coming to see the archive, talking to us, creating new work, and also asking our fellows to premiere their work with us.
Yeah.
But then the direction that it takes is, you know, as it were, in the fellows' hands, and can take all sorts of different things. You know, Hannah's thinking about a kind of Beckett festival, for instance. You know, as I say, we're happy to support our fellows in putting the work out there in whatever form it's happened, but we wouldn't want to prescribe how that might happen. And as Simon's sort of indicating, Claire-Louise as well, in a way the output from the fellowship is a kind of work in progress, or work in regress as Beckett would call it. So it could become a novel out of a short story, it could become a new kind of version of, you know, writing a self, multiple selves, etc., etc. So we're hoping there'll be an afterlife of the fellowship publication, as it were.
Stephen, I think we're out of time.
Oh, should we just take one more question, and then I'm afraid we've got to finish. Yes.
I was just wondering, over the course of studying Beckett, for having been studying you and seeing all in the archives, is there anything that you came to dislike about his writing?
Apart from everything, yes.
No, not really. No.
It's the same for me. I mean, I've become particularly interested in the early work. You know, you mentioned Dream of Fair to Middling Ringing, and you know, I haven't read much of the early work before. But what I find interesting is, you know, he's much more explicit about his working methods there somehow. You know, he's very reticent later on. You know, so maybe I was just a bit too dismissive of the early work previously, but now I can sort of, I've got a way into it a bit more. So, but yeah. But the short answer is no. So, yeah.
Well, lovely. Thank you to you for coming, and please thank Claire-Louise. Do just kind of have a look at our website. As I say, it's got work from our former fellows, it's got comments from our current fellows, and that's where we, as it were, put news out about what might be happening next, the festival, the publications, the talker, the liaison with Trinity in Dublin, and moving backwards and forwards between our fellowship programs, etc., etc. So that's a good way for keeping engaged, but I think we'd also like to do further events in and around London, so keep an eye on that. Okay, thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you.